Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Pharaoh Secondhand Ray Tau. Secondhand Ray Tau isn't the most famous Egyptian ruler who ever lived, but he may have had the worst death out of all of them. Secondhand Ray Tau II ruled over southern Egypt from 1558 until 1553 BC. His rule coincided with the occupation of northern Egypt by the Hyksos people, a group who invaded from the Levant. This was a highly unstable time for ancient Egypt. The kingdom in the north, ruled by invading foreigners, demanded tribute from the true Egyptian king in the south. Secondhand Ray Tau was so furious about the demands that he rebelled against the Hyksos king, and a war soon followed. The war began, if the legends are to be believed, because of some hippos. The Hyksos king complained about the noise from the hippos in the sacred pool of Thebes, and he demanded that the pool be destroyed. This was a horrible insult to the Egyptian people and may have been what pushed the exiled pharaoh to action. The next steps taken by the pharaoh, however, resulted in his own death and the brutal slaying of his son and successor, Kamose. Both of them died in battle, fighting against the invaders. But although the pharaohs lost their lives, their people succeeded in winning the war. After the death of Secondhand Ray Tau's son, his consort Ahatep I became queen regent, and she was ultimately responsible for securing victory for the Egyptian people. The pharaoh's tomb was discovered by archaeologists in 1886. One of the first things they noticed about his skeleton was that there was a hole in his skull. The general consensus was that he was killed in battle or murdered during a coup. The mummy stank so badly when the bandages were unwrapped, archaeologists assumed the terrible embalming job had been done on the battlefield. Using the newest in X-ray technology, scientists have finally learned the true fate of the pharaoh. Secondhand Ray Tau suffered a brutal demise. He had a huge cut across his forehead from an axe or a sword stroke. He was also hit in the face above his right eye by an axe. He had other cuts to his nose, and there was evidence of him being beaten by a blunt object. Researchers say the pharaoh was hit nearly a dozen different times in the face by swords and axes. Sahar Salim from Cairo University suggests the final killing stroke came from a spear jammed through the base of his skull. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. I wanted to give a big thank you to Joel Boyd KL6QM for the super thanks and for supporting this channel. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos like these. Number 9. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy and turned it into a fascist state in the early 1920s. Mussolini had a grand vision of reforming the Roman Empire and becoming the reincarnation of Julius Caesar. He became Prime Minister of Italy in 1922, then soon allied himself with Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. But the Roman Empire had been dead for a long time, and Italy's power after World War I had plummeted. Mussolini soon found his Italian army to be seriously outclassed by the rest of the world. And he never could have won a war against Europe on his own, so he relied entirely on Hitler for support. When things started to fall apart in 1943, the Italian people had had enough. Then, in July of that year, the Allies bombed Sicily and Rome. This prompted the Italian High Command, with permission from King Victor Emmanuel III, to capture Mussolini and put him on house arrest. He was then forced out of his seat of power, but his story wasn't over. In September 1943, Nazi paratroopers broke Mussolini out of the ski resort where he was being detained. Afterward, Hitler quickly installed Mussolini as the leader of the Social Republic of Italy, and if everything had gone according to plan, Mussolini would have been made the dictator of Italy. But the Nazis were losing control fast, and in April of 1945, the Nazis began negotiations for an unconditional surrender. When Mussolini learned what was happening, he was furious. He stormed out of his palace in Milan, got into his Alfa Romeo sports car and drove away with his young mistress sitting in the passenger seat. Mussolini knew his end was coming quickly, so he tried to escape. He and a small entourage tried to flee across the border into Switzerland, but before they made it, they were captured. The final moments of Italy's fascist leader on April 28, 1945, were spent in turmoil. He and his mistress were thrown into the back of a truck and hauled to the small village of Giulino de Mezzegre. There Mussolini was tied up to a post and he and his mistress were killed by firing squad. The Italian people were so disgusted by Mussolini that they descended on his corpse like scavengers and beat him until he was unrecognizable. The crowd of angry locals then strung his body up by his feet and hung it from the side of a gas station. Number 8. King Charles I. King Charles I wasn't the bravest man who ever lived. He wasn't particularly courageous or dignified, but the way he met his end was the first for a British monarch and a sign of things to come. Charles only became king because his brother Henry died of typhoid in 1612. He was a shy and insecure boy, and he didn't have much in the way of charisma. Charles also had a slight speech impediment, possibly from inbreeding, but despite all of his weaknesses, he was crowned king on February 2nd, 1626. And the year before, he'd married Henrietta Maria of France, joining the two countries in holy matrimony. The couple would then go on to produce 9 children. Charles may not have been a particularly bad guy, but he didn't know how to work with people. Historians say he was a good father behind closed doors and a loving husband, but he made enemies in Parliament because he didn't trust anyone except his wife. He never allowed himself to even consider the views of the opposing leaders, and as a result, Henry became unpopular. The thing about England during the 17th century was that the royal family was losing power. The parliamentarians were becoming stronger and stronger as England moved closer to democracy. This didn't sit well with Charles because kings had ruled the lands for centuries. The royal family believed in the divine right of kings to rule, but these people believed in their hearts that kings were chosen by God to rule the masses, and they thought nobody but God could force judgment upon them. Charles could have avoided disaster if he'd worked with the parliamentarians, but instead he went to war against military genius Oliver Cromwell. It was a civil war by every definition, and the bloodiest conflict ever waged on English soil. The Royalist army was defeated at the Battle of Naseby in June of 1645. There was still a bit of fighting up until 1649, but the turning point of the war was decided at Naseby. Charles was imprisoned, but he briefly escaped, only to be captured again. He was given every chance to repent and negotiate peace, but he refused. So, in the end, Charles I lost his head on January 30th, 1649. He was declared guilty of trying to maintain unlimited tyrannical power. He was also found guilty of betraying the liberties of the people. And in front of an audience at the banqueting house on Whitehall Road in London, Charles met the executioner. Number 7. Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's name will likely never be forgotten. He was the brilliant leader behind the expansion of the Roman Republic into Spain, France, Switzerland, Belgium, and Germany. His military exploits set the stage for the Roman Empire that would come in the decades after his death. Julius Caesar was also an educated man. He wrote about his travels, recorded his theologies, and even detailed his thoughts in notebooks. His popularity with the people of Rome was immense, and this really frustrated the members of the Senate. But what exactly was the Senate during the Roman Republic? The Senate was founded in 753 BC at the very beginning of Roman history, and as the last stones of Rome were laid, the final members of the Senate were appointed. They started as an advisory council with barely any power. At the time, executive magistrates wielded most of the power, but the Senate did eventually scrape themselves to the top. It took a few generations, but soon the Senate had absolute control over the Republic. These weren't elected officials either, but people appointed to the governing body. The senators didn't like Caesar because he was getting too much attention. He was also steadily accumulating his own power and influence. It began with the Gallic Wars, which were waged between 58 and 50 BC. After Caesar conquered the region known as Gaul, which today is the area that encompasses present-day Belgium, France, Switzerland, and Germany, he refused to give over control of his army. He then entered Rome in 49 BC as a man with his own personal fighting force and plunged Rome into chaos. Then in 44 BC, he was appointed dictator in perpetuity. It soon became abundantly clear to the Senate that Caesar was never going to give up power. He also appeared ready to purge Rome of the tedious senators and their games. So, on March 15, 44 BC, the senators struck back. Between 60 and 70 senators surrounded Caesar with knives and stabbed him over 20 times. But even with Julius Caesar dead, the Senate had lost their power, and they soon became as irrelevant as dinosaurs as the Republic crumbled. Number 6. King Croesus. King Croesus's last words are still used today. Just before the king was executed in 546 BC, he uttered the phrase, "Count no man happy until the end is known." The king had heard the phrase 3 years before his death, spoken by Solon the Athenian, one of the 7 wise men of ancient Greece. But when the king first heard the words, he was so wealthy and arrogant he couldn't comprehend their meaning. It wasn't until he was at death's door that he realized how true the phrase was. King Croesus is hardly one of the most famous leaders in the world. He was the king of Lydia between 560 and 546 BC. He conquered most of the Greek mainland in Asia Minor and ruled most of Anatolia. He enjoyed unprecedented wealth and had everything he could ever want handed to him on a silver platter, yet his life ended in sadness. The first blow to Croesus was when his 2 beloved sons perished in a hunting accident. Then his kingdom was besieged by the Persian Empire and their king Cyrus II. The Lydians formed an alliance with Babylon and Egypt, and they also reached out to Sparta to see if they'd send troops to aid them in the conflict. But when Cyrus attacked Sardis, no help came. King Croesus was then captured and sentenced to be burned alive. Legend has it that as he burned on the pyre, he shouted how right Solon the Athenian had been about life. He recited the final words he's still famous for today. And this is where history gets murky. Some accounts say he died there on the fire, but others claim he was whisked away by the gods who felt sorry for him. There's also a version of the story that says Cyrus was so moved by the speech that he spared Croesus and they became best friends. Number 5. Emperor Wang Mang. In the year 23 AD, the Imperial Chinese army was defeated. A total of 420,000 soldiers were beaten by rebel forces. The final available troops were convicts pulled out of local jails, but instead of fighting, they all fled into the forest. This left China's great capital, Chang'an, open for attack, so the rebels breached the defenses of the city and the emperor's private compound was raided. This was a bad day for Emperor Wang Mang. With his army of 500,000 soldiers defeated and his palace being ransacked, he sat deep within the interior of the building and waited to die. The emperor had spent the last 20 years trying to transform China for the better. At least, that was the way he saw it. But if you'd asked the rebels what they thought, they'd have said the emperor was a maniac. And maybe they were right. When the rebels finally broke through to the final hiding place within the endless palace, they found quite the scene. The emperor had surrounded himself with magicians and naked women. He was hiding in the imperial harem, encompassed by about 100 of his lady slaves. But this didn't stop the angry rebels, who tore him limb from limb. His head was removed and the rest of his body was pulled apart so that the soldiers could keep pieces of his body as mementos. One soldier even cut out his tongue and ate it to try to absorb the king's power. You're likely wondering why the rebels were so angry. Well, Emperor Wang Mang was extremely controversial because of certain reforms he tried to impose upon the Chinese people. Emperor Wang Mang invented an early form of social security payments. He also began to collect extra taxes from the wealthy to support the poor. He introduced government monopolies on products like iron and salt to help prevent rapid inflation. Then he banned the sale of cultivated land as a way to prevent farmers from getting rid of their properties after a bad harvest. Most of the things the emperor did were for the betterment of the people in the future. He even imposed a hefty tax on slave owners that made it too expensive for people to own slaves. And this gradually helped abolish the practice in China. But the peasants, the very people the emperor was trying to help, ripped his limbs off and ate his tongue. What do you think would be the absolute worst way to die? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, subscribe. Number 4. Emperor Atawalpa. The last emperor of the Inca Empire was sentenced to death on July 26, 1533. His name was Atawalpa, and his only crime was trying to protect his people. The Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, viewed the emperor and his influence as a threat. So they captured him and kept him in captivity for 9 months. But near the end of the 9th month, rumor began to circulate of an army on its way. The army was supposedly made up of 200,000 men and 30,000 savage cannibals. This frightened the Spanish, and so Pizarro made the decision that Atawalpa needed to die. The Spanish wanted to burn him alive as a heretic. After all, they were Christian fanatics, and every last Inca was a heretic in their eyes. But when Emperor Atahualpa was tied to the post, and the reality of being burned alive sunk in, he suddenly became religious. He then converted to Christianity and allowed himself to be baptized. And instead of being burned alive, Francisco Pizarro allowed the emperor to be strangled to death. Then afterward, the Spanish left his naked body in the courtyard for all his followers to see. Number 3. Queen Zenobia. Queen Zenobia was born sometime in the early 2nd century AD. She was the ruler of the Palmyrene Empire and an enemy of Rome. Her reign was during a very strange period in history known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome was thrown into anarchy. Civil war was breaking out all over the empire, and pieces kept breaking off to form their own governments. And at its height, the crisis shattered Rome into the 3 main regions: the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the Roman Empire. Very little is known about Zenobia's life, but what is known about her comes from the accounts of historian Zosimus in the 5th century AD, 300 years after her death. There are also historical accounts of the events surrounding Zenobia's life that paint a very clear picture. Zenobia married the Roman governor of Syria, Lucius Septimus Odeantus, in 258 AD, and they went on to have a son together. But there were some big issues between the rulers of Palmyra, the Sassanid Persians, and the Romans. Emperor Valerian of Rome attacked the Sassanids in 260 AD, but this turned out to be an epic failure. He was defeated and taken prisoner, and was used as a footstool by Sassanid king Shapur I. Emperor Valerian later died in captivity and was put on display. In response, Zenobia's husband, Governor Odeantus, tried to form an alliance with Shapur I. He wanted to join the Persians to take down Rome, but Shapur refused. Odeantus then used the Palmyrene army to push back the Persians and gain full control over the region, and by 261 AD he had enough power to separate from Rome and establish his own empire. But a few years later he was murdered by his nephew during an argument. This was when Zenobia became queen regent. Her son was still a minor, so she ruled in his stead, and she continued with her late husband's principles of forging a larger empire. Zenobia had dreams about her young son sitting on the throne in Rome, but things don't always turn out the way kings and queens expect them to. Queen Zenobia was ultimately defeated by the new emperor of Rome, Aurelian. She was brutally defeated in 272 AD and was captured. It's unclear exactly what happened next, but historians wrote that she met an extremely unpleasant end. To make an example of the conspiring queen, Aurelian allegedly had her paraded through the streets of Rome and then drowned in a river. But there are so many different stories historians don't know which one is true. Zenobia became such a legendary figure in the ancient world that she was the center of stories and legends for centuries. Even Catherine the Great in the 18th century compared herself to Queen Zenobia. Number 2. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette went from a beloved princess to a hated queen very quickly. When she arrived in France, Marie was a young Austrian princess. She had grace and charm that won over the hearts of all those she met, but as the years went on, she was slandered until her reputation plummeted. Her name was dragged through the mud, and being married to King Louis XVI certainly didn't help. The king was impotent and couldn't provide Marie Antoinette with a child, and historians say she was so depressed by this that she drowned her sorrows in gambling, high fashion, and secret dancing parties. Marie Antoinette was called every name under the sun. She was accused of inappropriate relationships with women of the court, and she was even accused of incest. So it didn't take long for Marie Antoinette to become the most hated woman in France. On October 5th, 1789, the poor people of Paris had reached a breaking point. Bread was scarce, and they were tired of hearing about the royal family's lavish feasts at their palace in Versailles. A whopping 7,000 angry peasants gathered outside the palace and demanded that the king and queen return to Paris, as they were needed to fix the shortage of food in their kingdom. The king and queen reluctantly went back to Paris, But things never really got any better. The French family tried to flee Paris in 1791, even though they knew the mob would kill them. The king wanted to take 2 carriages to be less conspicuous, but Marie Antoinette insisted on the bigger and more luxurious carriage. The bigger carriage was too slow, however, and they missed their military rendezvous. The royal family was then captured, taken back to Paris, and both of them were killed. King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793. Marie Antoinette was found guilty of treason and met her death the same way on October 16, 1793. Number 1. Captain Kidd. William Kidd wasn't your typical pirate captain. He wasn't a leader of scoundrels and thieves. William was born as an ordinary man in Scotland at the end of the 17th century. Then, at the age of 45, he became a sea captain and traveled to New York in 1690. Most of William's life was fairly ordinary. He was married and worked for the American colonies fighting enemy privateers. And in 1695, William was commissioned by the governor of New York to defend English ships from pirates while they sailed the Red Sea. Captain Kidd's entanglement with piracy started with the capture of the Querach merchant in February 1698. It was an Indian vessel sailing under a French pass. Captain Kidd captured the boat, which was filled with a wealth of gold and jewels. The boat also had a cargo of silk, sugar, and a whole heap of guns. Nobody was quite sure what the captain was doing. He was supposed to be working for the colonies, but William Kidd appeared to have suddenly changed his mind and became a pirate instead. The suspicion that he'd turned to piracy was confirmed when Captain Kidd sailed to Madagascar and visited the pirate town of St. Mary's to sell off his treasure. The captain was under the belief that the Querach merchant was a lawful prize for his work. He tried to clear his name by returning to New York and delivering himself willingly to the colonial authorities, but they absolutely despised him. William was then transported to London and stood trial in 1701. He faced 5 charges of piracy and 1 charge of murder. He was convicted on all counts and was sentenced to hang on May 23rd of that same year. William, who hadn't even realized that he was a pirate, was then strung up in front of an audience and killed. Which of these famous leaders do you think met the worst end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.